Welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show. I'm Joe. He's Nick. I'm in the studio, the Think Radio Broadcast Center in Ottawa, Canada's national capital. Nick is out on the farm, and you are listening to part 4 of this week's live broadcast. And that's only for you, podcast, not broadcast listeners out there. For those of you who are listening to the show live, if you want to participate in the chat room, you are always welcome. Click on the chat bubble on the player, and it will possibly take you to either a registration page or a login page. You have to do one or the other, and that's to prove that you're a real flesh and blood human being, because we only agree to allow flesh and blood human beings, no androids in our chat room allowed. Okay, yeah, got that out of the way. By the way, if you're listening to the podcast, you could still leave comments, and you do it the same way. So you click on the comment bubble or the chat bubble or whatever it is on the player that you're listening to, and it will take you somewhere where you can register or sign up or sign in, and then you can leave comments. And of course, that's to make sure that you're a real flesh and blood live human being and not an android or a malevolent algorithm or any of those other things lurking on the internet. So there you have it.
AJ just made a great comment in the chat room. He says, "No androids? I guess Biden won't be here."
Listen. If for those of you in the chat room, and for Nick as well, I think Nick, you saw this. But if anyone who hasn't seen it, you have to go on the internet on YouTube. And I hope it's still there. And it's Weekend at Biden's. Or it might be Weekend at Joe's. I don't know. Oh,
my God,
but it's a parody of the show, of the movie Weekend at Bernie's. Now, I'm just going to leave it there. It's up to you guys to check it out, because I'm just responding to the comments about Biden not being able to get into the chat room because... I guess, people are thinking he's an android or something like that. I don't know. But check that out. It's Weekend at Biden's, or it's Weekend at Joe's, but I'm pretty sure it's Weekend at Biden's. And it's a takeoff of Weekend at Bernie's.
I think so, too.
And it
was a great movie in its day.
It is funny. But if you're not
it didn't age very well. I went back and watched it later, but
if you're a Biden fan, you may not find it funny. But if I was a Biden fan, I would find it funny, because I always have a sense of humor around these things, Nick. I'm always looking.
Oh, you got to.
I'm always looking for the silver lining in the cloud, or if it's not silver, let's just say more silver than the rest of the cloud.
Fair enough. No, that movie was funny. I remember watching it when I was a kid. And some of the antics on are just hilarious. Now, it didn't age very well. It's not a timeless movie. But if you're of the right generation, then you're still going to find it hilarious because you'll identify with a lot of it. So that was it's worth going back, have another look at. Which has nothing to do with what we want to talk about next. We have heard the rumblings. We have very deeply placed spies within the media and within the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario who have hinted that we may be heading in for another lockdown. And I know that comes as a shock because nobody saw that coming. But the part that gets me is going into another lockdown, we need that like an extra hole in the head. I don't know where they get the idea that the province could survive another lockdown. From my opinion, from my point of view, I think it would be, I won't call it the kiss of death, but it's the kiss of life support. I mean, you really, anything left of the economy is going to be in big trouble. And I don't think I'm being overly dramatic when I say that, because if you don't have some method for people to go out and earn a living, the money that they're getting from the government has to come from somewhere. So where is that going to come from? And I know it sounds a little counterintuitive, but you've got to be able to pay the bills. And if you can't pay the bills, it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. what was that saying? Well, you got to be able to pay the rent. Somebody said that once, and I can't remember who it was.
Yeah, Malcolm.
But anyway, it's just.
Morton Blackwell. You can't change the world if you can't pay the rent.
It doesn't matter. That's it. See, that's why. Yes. And it's absolutely true. It doesn't matter about anything else if you can't meet your own basic needs. So if you don't have a method of doing that, what are you going to do when those bills are piling up at your door? How are you? So the idea that they want to put us through another lockdown is just so beyond imagination. My attitude about it is, if it didn't work the first time, what makes you think it's going to work this time? Because everything we've tried to this point hasn't worked, but we wouldn't be talking about a third lockdown.
Well,
so what do you think of that, Joseph?
Okay, so on this, I'm going to give, conflict is good radio. So let's have a little conflict here, okay, Nick?
Please go right ahead.
I am not defending lockdowns, but when you say they haven't had an effect, and that, I don't know that that's true, and I don't know any way of measuring this, and I don't know that anybody has actually measured it. But look, it's possible that, in fact, I would even say it's probable that the measures that the government has taken in terms of trying to keep people apart, wearing masks, social distancing, stay-at-home orders, et cetera, reduced the rate of infection, reduced the speed of the spread of this particular virus. Now, I'm not arguing about whether the virus is deadly, or any of the other statistics. I'm just saying that it's nobody went into these lockdowns with the intention that somehow or other it was going to stop the virus. The idea was that it would slow it down, and I think you can make a strong case that it has slowed it down. When you do the lockdown, when you do whatever measures, the number of cases have dropped. So I'm not saying this in support of lockdowns. I'm against lockdowns. But I think that we should be accurate in the way that we're portraying the situation. And I don't think it's fair for us to say that it hasn't worked, because that all depends on how exactly you define working. It was never meant to stop the pandemic. And nobody in their right mind, I shouldn't say, I don't know if they actually sat around the table and said, this is a good idea to stop the pandemic. I guess I should walk that statement back. Maybe there are stupid people in that room that really thought it would be. But, from my perspective, as much as I disagreed with the measures, I'm not prepared to say that it had no effect. I'm not prepared to say that in the narrow perspective of the spread of the disease, of the virus, if I look at that just perfectly narrowly from that statistic alone, I would have to argue that probably all of these measures did have a positive impact. Of course, the damage done through these measures, I think, was immensely and has been immensely worse than the illness passing through the population would have been. But that's a different measure, and it's a different concern. So I don't support the lockdowns on any level, but I do think that, just from that one narrow perspective, I do think that they were beneficial.
Well, okay, so if you want controversy, all right, I'll give you some controversy, because in a way you kind of stole my thunder with the last thing you said. While I'm not accusing anybody of being a rocket scientist involved in this and should have known better, because to be fair, as you like to be, nobody really knew what to do when it comes to dealing with this. They didn't know how serious it was going to be. They didn't know whether the implementation of what they wanted to do was making sense. The problem with that, though, is you have now a situation where we've learned a ton of things about this virus. We know its lethality. We know, and people would argue with me on that as well, saying, oh, no, we don't. Yeah, well, yeah, I think we have a pretty good idea now. But the bottom line is they should have learned from the mistakes. A lot of other regions learned from the mistakes that they made, corrected those mistakes, and are now much further down the path of getting back on their feet than we are. So I'm not going to cut them the kind of slack that you are. I just think that these guys should have said, okay, we've tried this twice. The numbers, they do go down for a little bit, but then they come back up again. And I don't think it's because we're in quarantine or we're not in quarantine. I think this is a natural rhythm or cycle of the virus. I mean, in every disease, it has a life. It has to run its course. And when it's running its course, the numbers will go up and down until it's finished. So whether or not these things actually made a difference, you're right, it's hard to determine. But the damage, as you point out, done by these kinds of things is far worse than the disease is. So why are we going to continue down that path in the first place? Why don't we just say, okay, we have to find another way to do this, get control of it, let's recognize where the greatest risk is, deal with that, and let everybody else get back to work, because we have to pay for this somehow. And I know that sounds cold and it sounds uncaring and all that, but how cold or uncaring is it to leave this debt and burden to people who aren't even born yet? To me, that's a huge selfish attitude. Oh, I'm not paying for it. My kids will and my grandkids will. Okay, so you want to leave that as your legacy then? No, I'm sorry. We need to deal with this now, and we cannot keep putting it off. We have to accept the fact that the money tree only has so many leaves on it, and we've plucked it pretty much naked. And it's time to step back and say, lockdowns, even if they do have some kind of mitigating effect, are not working the way they're supposed to. Our government is not trustworthy. They can't run a one-man race to a two-man outhouse. What makes us think they can handle this? And to lock it down again and do even more damage, especially the small business, is insane in my estimation.
Well, you know, Nick, you're not going to get an argument from me on most of those points. I want to reiterate, I am absolutely, adamantly opposed to locking down, whatever you want to call it, stay-at-home orders, shutdown, isolate. I'm against all of this stuff. I think that it does more harm than good. I'm just talking about the very narrow perspective of whether or not, you know, if you thought that the speed with which this was passing through the population was a problem, then for sure, you know, I think that it had a positive impact. But, you know, talking about, Nick, finding silver lining, you know, in the clouds, there's a travel agency in Europe that has, you know,
oh, yeah.
God bless the free market. Okay. So these guys have figured out, they've come up with, for want of a better term, vaccine vacations. If you have a little bit of spare cash, this is not something that you have to be rich for, but you have to have, you know, a few $1,000s kicking around, like you would probably spend on a go-away vacation anyway. So what you can do is you can fly to one of the international airports in Moscow. This is a vacation package, by the way. And as you're passing through the airport, so you're not actually entering Russia, you're just transferring planes. And as you're